All right, so thank you all for getting up early, for getting up in the maybe midday, because we have representatives from across the globe, and so we appreciate the adjustment given our different time zones. For those who are new to the What's Your Diversity program, in short, we select 2 or 3 people, often faculty, staff, or students, from all of our campuses to share a little bit about themselves. I've sent them some questions in advance for them to make comments about, and I'll state those questions for you all. That should take us about 30 minutes into our time together, and then after that, we'll leave some time for Q&A for you to be able to ask questions of our guests today. You can ask those questions using the chat function, and I can restate those questions on your behalf. Or you can unmute yourself and use your voice to state your question. Or you can get the attention of the interpreter to have your thoughts communicated. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to just give a brief introduction of yourself, who you are, if you want to share your gender pronouns that you prefer to use in the space, what campus you're representing, what you teach, and any other little interesting fact you might want to share, and then we'll jump into the specific questions. Let's start with Rebecca.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. It's afternoon over here. It's really nice to be part of this conversation. So I'm currently in Dubrovnik at our Dubrovnik, Croatia campus. I've been teaching here for almost 20 years. And so I'm in the English department mostly. I teach a variety of different writing and literature courses over here. We also have a tourism degree program. And so I teach a course in our tourism program as well, the Capstone Research Project. I'm originally from the East Coast of the United States. So Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Jersey. I spent a lot of time there. I did spend a year in upstate New York, in Lake Placid, and a year in Birmingham, Alabama. So I've had the benefit of living in a few different places in the United States, but really the biggest change of my life has been spending the last 20 years over here in Dubrovnik.
Thank you. Anyone can go next, and I'll let you choose.
All right, should I go next so we don't lose time? All right, so my name is Jakub, also from Croatia, from the other campus in Croatia, and that is in Zagreb. And I teach writing courses, critical reading and writing seminar, and introduction to academic English. And basically at this point, that's enough for an introduction.
I can go up next, Taj.
Yep.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Great to see faculty from Croatia. I kind of hear and read about what you guys are doing there, so it's really great for us to come together. Thank you for that opportunity, Taj. My name is Ambareen Al-Khadr, and my pronouns are she and her. I am originally from New Delhi, India. I was born in a smaller town up north, and then my family moved to New Delhi. And then from there, my family moved to Libya. That's where I spent a little bit of my childhood. And then from Libya, we moved back to India. My father was going to Canada, but he chose to go back to India, and then I'm here. I moved upstate in 2015. I've studied in Philadelphia at Temple University. That's where I did my graduate school from. That was my first experience of America in 2009 when I came here as a graduate student. I teach in the School of Film and Animation, and I'm a filmmaker, and I teach, and my research and my teaching kind of inform each other. And I work between the US and India with focus in New Delhi and Mumbai currently. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for that. So my first questions I'm going to direct to folks who are in Croatia. And if you could tell us a little bit about your experience in Croatia, since I would assume some of us have been there and some may not have, but tell us about your experience. And if you are not from that part of the world, how does it compare to where you grew up? And whoever wants.
Jakob, you want me to start this one? Because
Yeah, I think you're the one who has a better perspective as someone coming from a different country and yeah, being objective, right?
yeah. Okay, so I've been here in Croatia for 20 years, and it really feels like home to me now. So I have to kind of go back in my mind and remember, what was it like when I first got here, and how did it feel? And I guess I would say it's I think it's always difficult to all of a sudden be in a different place than you're accustomed to. And to be in a totally different country and a different continent is even more. And I think the thing that I remember is, well, of course, I was in many ways just delighted and charmed and having a great time because Croatia is a beautiful, really a beautiful place. And I had a job, and my husband came with me. So, I had a whole secure life. But in public, just really for the first time in my life, feeling really out of my element. And especially the language being, I didn't really speak Croatian at all before I got here. And the language barrier, which I'm really happy to say I've overcome since I've been here. So now I'm fluent. I'm not perfect, but I do consider myself to have achieved a kind of bilingual status in the point that I could live my life in Croatian and do my business and talk to people and do all the things that I needed to do. But at the very beginning, it was an uncomfortable experience, just feeling kind of helpless and powerless and not understanding what you're looking at when you see people doing things that are different from the way you do them, or not understanding them. You simply don't know what you're looking at. But I think that uncomfortable feeling is really worth it. And especially what I would say to the students who are here in the audience is that getting out of your comfort zone, that's kind of a cliche, but it really is true, is an important way to grow. And if you're secure enough in yourself to really, truly encounter people who are really different from you, it will help you understand more about what you really believe. I mean, it's kind of, you don't know what you think, you don't know what your way is. It's so normal to you that you can't even figure out who you are until you come in contact with somebody who's really different from yourself. So that's just an amazing learning experience that I hope, I really suggest that everybody try to get into your life in some way or another. You don't have to move to a different continent. But in your contacts with people who are different from you, to view those as a learning opportunity for yourself, really.
Thank you. Jacob?
Yeah, so in terms of Croatia and the sort of experience here, it's actually a very difficult question for me when people ask where you're from, because I was actually born in New Delhi, India. Where I lived for a couple of months only. And then I moved to a different country, Bosnia, for 6 years, where my parents are from, and then moved to Croatia, to a small town, then a bigger town, then a city. So it's very confusing when people ask, where are you from? I never know what to say. Is it my birthplace, or where I lived for the first 6 years, or is it where I live now, or is it where I work, because it's a different place? But in terms of what Croatia is, or the experience, I think Rebecca gave a good, picture of what Croatia is in terms of its geographical location and beauty, but also the challenges that you can face. But since we're talking about diversity, when you think about diversity in Croatia, it's not something people here would put in the same sentence, because Croatia is pretty monocultural, and there's really little diversity, visible diversity, that you can see in terms of race, ethnicity, and so on. And if you were to ask Croatian people, in terms of racism and so on, and they would say no, and some of them would admit, just because we haven't encountered any other races, which sounds really strange when you think about the globalized world, but for some reason, Croatia is intact in that way. And unfortunately, people here in Croatia forget that we do have marginalized communities, such as the Roma people, and the way we treat them is not very nice. It's not very welcoming, and it's not inclusive. So when you point that out, then people in Croatia start to think about, oh, okay, so that's diversity, and we do have different races. So that's one perspective.
Thank you. I'll give the interpreters a chance to switch. All right. So similar question for you, Ambareen. Based on where you grew up, or different places you spent time, how does that compare to the Rochester, New York area?
So I remember the time in 2015 when I was so thrilled when I got this job offer, and I said, I'm going to. My father always sort of instilled this idea in me that you have to create your own path and you have to live your own life, and that thought really. And I lost him in 2013, but so in this kind of way, I was very happy that I'm he's proud of what I've done. And so I packed my two bags and I sort of landed in Rochester, New York. And it was, I think, Malcolm, who was the chair of the program at the film program back then, said, this is the worst winter of 30 years, right at when I arrived. I mean, it was so cold. I had never seen this kind of cold. I had been to Philadelphia. That's where I had studied. So I thought, and that taught me a lot because, I thought to myself, why did I think that all of America is going to be like Philadelphia? That was just my own understanding and learning of the diversity of what America is. America too is diverse. Um, and that was just the starting point. So I learned how to deal and live through that cold. I had friends, I mean, my colleagues. I remember that one morning when I opened the door to my office, and my colleague Kathleen Ashworth, Professor Kathleen Ashworth, had put two very warm gloves for me in my faculty. Just I could take it out and wear them. And those human gestures have just been so rewarding. It is tough and challenging, but I think at the same time you make these amazing connections with people, which for me has been very, very meaningful. I remember the time I didn't know how to use a dishwasher. So I was in my apartment and I put in I didn't know you use separate detergent for the dishwasher, and I put the normal detergent in, and I'm prepping for my class the next day, and I come into the kitchen and it's a huge mound of just laundry, like suds and kind of this is floating all over the kitchen. Um, there was a lot of comedy. There was just a lot of also, I mean, I would second what Rebecca just said in terms of, I felt out of place. I felt people told me you have an accent. And for me, as I was growing up, Americans always had an accent. It was very disorienting for me. For a lot of times I was like, where am I? Like, what is going on in life? And then it took an active process of processing cultural difference and the idea of difference in my own life and how I understand that. Um, the ability to also then sort of draw and make new connections, I think for me has been the most rewarding part of the challenges of also sort of relocating across half the globe and continents.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for all of you to consider, this next part is, you've all lived in different parts of the world. So again, this might be a challenge to nail down. But is there a fond memory of any of those places where you've lived that you can remember and you wouldn't mind sharing with us? A memory that's positive, about a given area, and why is that?
Anyone? Rebecca, want to go up first?
Okay, well, one thing that comes to my mind, like I said, I've been here in Dubrovnik for 20 years. And that was a really sort of surprising move. I would never have predicted earlier in my life that I would end up living outside the United States at all, really. It wasn't like I had a big plan, like someday I want to move to Europe. It was just one of those things that sort of life went in that direction and opportunities were there, and it just sort of happened. But before I moved here, as I mentioned, I did have a chance to live in Birmingham, Alabama for a year. I was in journalism. I worked at the newspaper there in Birmingham. And at that time, that was one of the most sort of unusual, surprising long distance moves that I had ever made. I didn't know I was going to move much further at some other point. But I really enjoyed my year in Birmingham, and it was my first time experiencing Southern American culture, really. And like Ambareen just pointed out, you know, it's funny to talk about American culture. I think it's pointless to talk about American culture. It's 350 million people and such a diverse country that we can't really say American culture is this or American culture is that. You can find everything. That's one thing that actually I find myself saying here. When I'm here in Croatia or I'm here in Europe and people say, oh, Americans are like this or Americans are like that. And then I constantly have to point out, well, you can't say Americans are just one thing like this or that. Some stereotypes are true, some are not, you know, and you can find every single kind of person and lifestyle somewhere in America. So, you know, those things are sort of useless and you kind of have to fight against them. But to get back to sort of a fond memory of Birmingham, you know, I wanted to fit in there and I wanted to get along with people, not only because it was part of my job, but I wanted to meet people and be friends and feel like part of the community. And I really sort of accidentally developed kind of a Southern accent while I was down there. And I had, back then we had answering machines, you know, and I had some of my friends call me and they listened to my message on the answering machine and they left a message saying, Rebecca, you got a Southern accent, you know, how did that happen? And I was like, well, gosh, I have no idea. But, and I started, you know, and I started using sir and ma'am, which is not something that I was not raised with those words, you know, to say sir and ma'am. But when I got to Birmingham, I learned very quickly that those are really important and really necessary. And I didn't want to come off being disrespectful accidentally to people that I needed to show respect to. So, you know, that was just one of the small ways where I actually felt good about adapting, you know, and I felt like, okay, I know how to sort of begin to navigate this culture. And I can really say it felt natural and good. And I was, you know, sort of happy. I didn't feel bad about changing myself. I felt good about changing myself to be able to sort of be a member of a different community.
Thank you. I could relate in with the sir, ma'am, and also had Mr. when I was living in Cincinnati. First time in the Midwest, and students would call me Mr. Taj or sir, and I was like, no, I'm not old enough for that, right? But that was a custom that I certainly had to get used to because of that.
Right.
Thank you. Jacob or Ambareen, any order, doesn't matter.
I'll take it, Taj.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I constantly, much like I think what Jacob said, it's hard for me to sometimes even clarify to myself, well, where am I from? I've spent 5 years here, 3 years of my life earlier in Philadelphia, then New Delhi, and then Libya. So what I recall is always sometimes a mix of things. I am a big one at food. I mean, I think my cultural association and memory all the time goes back to the idea of food, the memory of being in a restaurant or a certain recipe or a dish. So in my friend, and this incident is from my time in upstate New York. I was living in this apartment complex, which is quite famous for new immigrants who come to this to Rochester. It's like a little mini sort of South Asia there because there are so many of us in that particular apartment complex. And I was actually having a really difficult day because, I mean, you miss your food and you miss your family and your language, the experience and just the sensory experience of being inside a language. And I was just very homesick, and I still get homesick on a lot of days even now. As I was sitting and working, I was writing something. I could smell this amazing. It's a rice dish. It's called biryani. This smell was just like, I didn't know. I'm like, am I losing it? Like, what's going on with me? So I step outside my apartment and I just like chased the path to where the smell was coming from, and I actually knocked at the door because it was just the best biryani I could smell. And this wonderful lady opens the door, and I've been friends with her since. Her name is Nahid, and she is from Pakistan. And in my country, because of the relationship India has with Pakistan, I mean, it's not possible for me to travel to Pakistan, and it's also not possible for a lot of Pakistanis to travel to India. And at one point, we were one country before 1947. So it took me, sometimes I just sort of was really surprised that you have to move half the continent sometimes to actually be able to form those connections, which are, we were one people. I came here and then she came here, and here we are in Rochester, appreciating each other's food and friendship and the ability. So because she speaks in my language, which is Urdu, um, I sometimes just go to her apartment now to just have chai with her or just sit down and talk to her. And I think for me, finding that comfort has been one of the just the fascinating part of so yes, you develop networks and friendships in a new culture, and in a very beautiful way, some of the old networks and friendships and associations also find a new ground. So she became a great friend of mine. She sends me food. I think once a month I get a big sort of a case of biryani from her, and that's what I eat. So that's my fond memory of a friend that I made. Yeah,
Thank you. Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, so just briefly in terms of Taj's question, when thinking about moving, from country to country and town to town, when I think about it, maybe I wouldn't point out a certain, fond memory, but I would point out that I never felt as a stranger. And although it's difficult for me to say where you're from when someone asks me, but I never felt as a stranger in these countries or these towns. And I think this has to do that it was always the whole family moving. Sometimes it was even the extended family, and having that sort of support helped me not feel a stranger anywhere that I've lived.
Thank you. I'm sure that definitely makes a big difference versus if you had to go somewhere alone. All right. So my next question, and some of you hinted at this already, but I'll ask it anyway, is how do you define diversity? And how has that changed over the course of your lifetime, if at all?
I'll jump in on this one. Um, Earlier in my life, um, diversity is a difficult word. I think it's a positive word, but it's become sort of a buzzword now, and it's easy to it's one of the words actually that I would tell my writing students not to use because it's so abstract, and we don't know what it means, and it just sort of generally sounds nice, and it's one of those things you can throw in a sentence to sort of sound good, but nobody really knows what that means exactly. But it's just sort of a good thing, So it's a word that really I think we need to think deeper about. And not and to avoid we use it as a nice synonym for just sort of, I'm open-minded, I'm a tolerant person, I like people, I'm nice, so I like diversity, right? Like people say, I like peace is good, I like peace, I like diversity, but and that's all sort of nice, but I think it's a word we need to think deeper about. Everyone wants to think of themselves as an open-minded and tolerant person. Of course you do. And when you see people who are different from you, most of us want to be friendly. Nobody wants to be mean. But I think if we're going to really use that word in a useful and productive way, I would get a little beyond that. And for me, it means really willing to, what I kind of said earlier, to allow yourself, you know, your little version of what is normal, your little version of sort of what is good, the way you were raised, and particularly if you were raised in a place where most of the people that you are with most of the time are just like you, to be willing to sort of let go of that, or to be able to, even for the first time in your life, really see what your own culture is. Because you can't figure out what your culture is until you run into something that is different, right? And really to be able to learn from people who are different, and to be able to even let go of some of the things that you were raised with, or some of the things that seem normal to you, and really sometimes accept a different way of doing things and allow yourself to change, right? And so I can see, you know, that I have changed, where, for example, what you said about saying Mr. or using those kinds of polite phrases, you know, there's a part of me in the way that I was raised was like, oh, you don't have to call me, you know, professor, you don't, you know. And I'll just use an example of language, because I'm a language person. English is one of the only languages in the whole world which just uses the word you all the time for everyone. So I can say you to someone I know well, I can say you to a student, I can say you to my boss, and it's the same you. But in almost every other language in the world, you actually have different words for you, one which is more polite, right? And one which is more in showing of respect, kind of like Mr. And one which is more close and personal, and you use with your friends. And some languages even have more than two, you know, it's a way of showing respect. And so one of the things, at first when I got here, I didn't like that students called me professor, and they used these very polite words with me, and they didn't know what to do with the word you in English. So to make it more polite, they would put a capital letter Y on it, to sort of as a way to be more polite if they were writing me an email. And I was raised more in an atmosphere where people are sort of equal and casual, and call professors by their first name, you know. But with time, I kind of came around to a different way of thinking about that, and I was okay with being called professor, and I was okay with having these sort of polite forms of address used to me. And so that's just a sort of small example of the way that my thinking sort of came around, on just one small way. But I think that's what diversity is allowing your own thinking about something to come around really to a different point of view.
Thank you. Can't hear you, Ambareen.
I think Rebecca put it so well and so comprehensive, and I think that's, I would second what she just said in terms of the ability to have an expanded lens on who we are. I think, you know, all of us, as we go through life, as we grow up, you start really, first of all, your worldview is shaped by where you grow up, where you're born, your family and your friend circle, and I grew up in New Delhi, but I did grow up as the only, you know, grown up in a Muslim family. So I grew up in an environment where I felt like, am I the only one? I found myself so a lot of times hiding parts of myself, like, oh, they shouldn't know that my family actually wears the headscarf. They shouldn't know that my mother actually prays. I mean, I used to hide all these things about myself throughout school. I think it has been actually very recent, and I'm a well-grown adult now. It has taken me so many years to actually undo that part of my conditioning. And at the same time, have the ability to realize that as a human being, I have my own blind spots. So in the pursuit of sort of enlightening myself, how can I look at another way of life and learn from it and have respect for it? I think diversity for me is much more than a concept. It is a word. It is action. I mean, it's not just a word in terms of what it represents, but it actually, for me, means action, which means what am I doing to expand my lens, to look at the world from someone else's point of view. You know, I teach filmmaking, both documentary and fiction, and the concept of point of view, that's such a powerful tool in unraveling someone else's, probably, you know, when you write and when you create, you're probably, there's this concept that you write from what you know, what you've experienced. So a lot of times my characters are Muslim women who are hiding the fact that they actually wear the hijab, but actually also at some point of time in their life, they are okay with it and they take it off and they actually wear it somewhere that they don't wear it in certain places. Like all of us are, we are, you know, rather than looking at oneself as a victim, looking at oneself as an agent of one's own history, to be able to write and define oneself through using point of view and writing and dialogue and creating. So I think, you know, for me, the concept that diversity means difference, that's a concept. For me, it is, okay, what can I do to make it an actionable item that my world then starts to look different and inclusive? And diversity for me is also very closely tied with equity. It should lead to equity. It should lead to an equity not only in terms of representation, that we should look all different, but the ability to be able to speak, the ability to know that you have a voice. Like, I've grown up in a culture for the longest time, you would constantly question, does my experience have validity? Does my point of view even does it even deserve to be shared? And it has, I'm really you know, um, blessed, or whatever the word you want to call it, because I think it is just a great gift to be able to realize that and have that perspective on life and learn through hiding, but also learn through revealing and learn through owning up. I think, you know, so all those concepts, both in my teaching and my research, are deeply ingrained. Thank you, Taj. Yep, that.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Jacob?
Yeah, so when thinking about diversity, I think of it in terms of diversity being all the ways that people are being themselves. And some of these ways are normalized and some of these ways are marginalized. And that's for what it comes down to for me when I think about diversity. And diversity has not always been, you know, in the focus of my interest or any interest at all, to be honest. This happened actually 10 years ago, and you may think it's a silly story, but um, this was a turning point for me. So I worked in elementary school teaching English to children from 6 to 14 years of age. And with young children, you use picture books, right? And somehow, I don't remember how, but I got a picture book called My Granny's a Juggler, which is a picture book where the granny is a juggler and she juggles household items, and her granddaughter is in a wheelchair, right? So the granddaughter and the grandma are the main characters, and the granddaughter is in the wheelchair. But it's not about, the story's not about wheelchair or anything. It just, this character was in a wheelchair, and for me, this felt so normal. And then I started asking myself, okay, why don't I see other characters in wheelchair, or people using guide dogs, or people with turbans or headbands or burqas in English language teaching materials? And that for me was an eye-opening experience when you look at all the course books in, for example, in Croatia, but I think it's pretty much the same across the world when it comes to English language teaching materials, that you do not see people who are different from a certain norm. And that's when I started thinking about diversity. So it's not just about race, but everything else that people are um, being themselves.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate the different nuances you all brought to that question, and that trying to define what I would agree as this big, sometimes abstract concept. And it requires us living it to kind of bring it to life. All right, so I want to ask you a final question as a panelist. And so this is a signal to the participants to get your questions ready. So again, feel free to put those in the chat. I can restate those, or you can unmute yourself and voice your own question, or you can get the attention of the interpreter and to be able to communicate your thoughts and perspectives. All right, so my final question for our guest panelists today is, Are there any recommendations you could offer us for us to continue our learning in regards to any cultural background you come from or part of the world you come from, or just in general around diversity broadly? Any recommendations? Those recommendations can be podcast, music, activities like travel, dancing, books, etc. So any recommendations, you know, 2 or 3 that each of you could offer us.
Well, I'll jump in. For anyone who wants to learn more about Croatia, the obvious answer is just come here. I'm going to pretend that pandemic is not happening, and that travel is normal. And I hope that it will be normalized, and travel and moving around is something that we're all going to be able to do more than we can do now. Because there's really no substitute for face-to-face contact and really being somewhere. And so really, come to Croatia. You will really love it. It's a beautiful country. And it's a small country. You know, there's only about 4 million people in Croatia. But there is so much diversity within the country in terms of different lifestyles. As Jakob mentioned, it's not a particularly racially or ethnically diverse country. It's pretty homogeneous in that regard. But what you can see is different regional lifestyles, everything from the food, the architecture, the lifestyle, the way people spend their time. So I would say, you know, come and visit and meet people. If you can't come and visit, there are some pretty amazing videos out there. A lot of them are made by tourists. And I would, you know, if you want to just sort of see what it looks like to come and visit, you can't get here, take a look at some of those tourist videos. You will see some surprising and beautiful things just in terms of the nature, in terms of the cities, and catch kind of a glimpse into what the lifestyle here is like. Don't go too much by Game of Thrones. That's what I have to say about Dubrovnik. You know, everybody's is sort of there. I don't know what to say about Game of Thrones except that you know, it's a TV series. It's not real life. And they sure did add a lot of extra animation post production to that. But if that does sort of interest you, I would encourage you to sort of go further than just the little Game of Thrones motif and try to see what it's really like.
Thank you for that. And Rebecca, if you happen to have a link or a resource to some of those tourism videos, that would be helpful.
Okay, sure. If I can send you some links.
Okay.
When we're done with this, sure.
Thank you.
I would recommend I listen to this podcast called Immigrantly, and Immigrantly it's just cross-cultural conversations, and I find this the person who does this podcast, she invites writers, filmmakers, sort of chefs. I mean, it just is a cross-cultural, intersectional podcast. I love it. I start my day sometimes with that. I think for me, just watching films has been just such a great way of understanding different cultures. So, you know, if you get a chance to watch an Iranian film, go watch it. You will see a completely different way of life. If you get a chance to watch a Hindi film or an Urdu film, go do that. On Netflix in the next coming week, there's a film called Bombay Rose that is going to be released. It's an animated feature. And it's a beautiful story set in Mumbai. And I think sometimes, you know, when you see, so I've sort of asked myself, well, what role do stories play in creating diversity and cross-cultural dialogue? And for me, it adds that extra, I think, you know, Taj, you mentioned the concept of nuance and an extra layer, that there's something very coded in the kind of an activism-based space that we're trying to achieve a certain objective in terms of diversity or inclusion or an expanded understanding. And I think stories are very subtle ways of sort of, so in terms, stories are not that kind of, it's not that you'll watch this one film and suddenly you will understand Iranian culture. It'll just open a little crack in that wall that a little bit of light will come from, and then probably you'll be fascinated and you just want to jump through that wall and see what this window is all about. So if you can go to a restaurant, you know, you've not eaten a certain cuisine, like, let me go and try this food. I mean, for me, Rochester has been one of those places where I've just gone into different restaurants and I've eaten different kinds of things. So again, you know, stepping out as much as you can, safely, I think, given our times, very, very safely. But yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so Rebecca has already given you some ideas about how to learn more about Croatia. But what I can do is basically share my reading list or my pile of books next to the bed on the nightstand. And I think it's important whenever we think of diversity or talk about diversity to go beyond the context of your country and the problems that you have in your country, wherever that is. So currently I'm reading about all the horrible things that were done in Congo by the Belgian people previously. And I'm also reading, and this is something that I could recommend, a book called Growing Up Aboriginal. It's a collection of short stories by Aboriginal people, sort of documenting how it is, how it felt growing up in Australia as an Aboriginal person in the past century. And this is something that I think is very important in order to understand the whole issue, to get a wider perspective than just focusing on a single country or a single issue, but just sort of think about what diversity means in different countries and what are the issues when it comes to equity and equality.
Thank you. All right, so I have, I think 2 questions here in the chat. So the first one is from Kathy, and Kathy asks specifically of Rebecca and Jacob, how has the pandemic impacted your daily lives? How have people in your regions adjusted to wearing masks, keeping distance, etc.?
I think, you know, Jakob, we should probably answer this separately because I think the scene in Zagreb is probably different than the scene in Dubrovnik. So Jakob and I are as we mentioned, on 2 different campuses in Dubrovnik. Jakob is in the capital city of Zagreb, which is about 1 million people, you know, and it's a big city. I'm in Dubrovnik, which is essentially a small town that lives off of tourism. And right now, since we don't have any tourists and it's the winter season, it's a very quiet kind of small town feeling. So I will say for Dubrovnik, the epidemiological situation here is not so bad. We did have a lockdown in the spring when everything went online, and it was rather severe for a couple of weeks. But right now, life is feeling fairly normal. People are wearing masks indoors, especially on our campus. We're having live in-person classes, but obviously with a lot of masking, with a lot of distancing. But out in public, people are wearing masks on public transportation. People are wearing masks in shops. But overall, life is feeling fairly normal, although there simply just aren't the crowds of tourists that we're used to having. And of course, you know, it's kind of funny. Dubrovnik as a tourist destination, you know, in 2019, our biggest problem was overcrowding. I mean, we would have days in the summer season when there would be just thousands and thousands and thousands of people crowded into the old city, and the old city has a wall around it with gates. So it's really quite limited amount of space, and you would have people packed in there, which is just unthinkable. I mean, it's crazy to even think. I can't believe we did that. But that was before. So it's really kind of causing Dubrovnik, I think, to rethink our whole tourism approach. You know, what is tourism going to really look like now, if in this new sort of circumstance where we want people to come visit, and how are we going to reorganize ourselves, you know, in a safe way?
Yeah, right. Just to add to this, maybe that generally looking at the question, that I think people in Croatia are pretty disciplined when it comes to wearing masks and keeping the distance, in a way that we do not have a lot of people who are vocal and strongly against it. So we only had 2 protests so far, and it was just, not a lot of people showing up to these protests. So generally people following the guidelines and trying to stay safe. Again, depending on the region and where people are more laid back towards the south, and but generally I would say we're doing a good job.
Thank you. And my apologies. I've been saying Jacob and it's Jakob. Jakob?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
All right. No, I want to get it. I want to get how you.
Yeah, it's okay.
I think I also said Jacob. I apologize for
No,
that. It's
that's
Jakob.
fine.
I was just checking myself too. Yeah.
Yep.
No, not a problem at all.
All right. Thank you for your humility.
Thank you.
All right. So the other question we have is from Lori. Any tips for teaching and talking with children about diversity?
Well, maybe I can jump in here. So depending on the age level, and one of the reasons why I'm reading this book, Growing Up Aboriginal, is that I'm still somewhat involved in English language teaching as a reviewer for some course books and materials. And for the past 10 years, I've been sort of suggesting authors and publishers to be more diverse in their materials. And one of my ideas is sort of to offer teachers more material that would cover diversity. And in this book, Growing Up Aboriginal, there are some stories which could be read in elementary school. And especially as some of them are written from the perspective of a child of growing up. And that's one way. If you find a very good short story that is appropriate for elementary school, that's one way to approach it, because this is like coming from a real person experiencing this. And that would be my suggestion, and maybe the other speakers could say other suggestions.
I like Ambareen's suggestion about food. That food is just a great way and a fun way to meet other cultures, and if you can go to a restaurant, where they have the music, where they have the maybe the decor of the place, and thinking about the way that the food is served, or the even the utensils that people are using to eat, and all of those things. I think that's a great way to teach kids, by doing and experiencing something. I do remember when I was very young, the first time that I went to New York City, and my parents took me to New York City. And one of the things, I was maybe 8 or younger, and my father told me, when we go to New York, you'll hear people speaking other languages as you walk down the street. Listen carefully, and you'll hear people speaking languages that are not English. And I did. And that was the most exciting feeling. I was thrilled. I was like, wow, this is so cool. And some of the languages my parents were able to recognize. They would say, oh, that's French, or oh, that's Spanish, or there's a language I never even heard before. But that was really thrilling and sort of exciting experience for me as a child, that obviously has sort of stayed with me to this day, and really just made me feel good about encountering people who were different.
Yeah, I think in short stories, food, absolutely, I would second that. I think sort of just it's hard because there's just not one way one can do it, especially when you're dealing with children. But I think having people over, or friends who just sort of look different, or I think I have a nephew who's actually the one who's calling me about, he calls me around this time every day. He has to, he's five now, so he can jump on the WhatsApp and call. So he's now slowly learning that what Americans look like, of course. And for him, at 5 years old, I'm probably I'm beginning that process, that how do I explain what America or Americans, I mean, Americans are not one people. It's a very, very, they look very different. So the whole concept of race, the whole concept of ethnicity, from the point of view of a 5-year-old, so I've started introducing him to, I send him pictures of my friends, and my friends look very different from the people that his friends look. We are beginning to start doing that just with him, and I feel that the more you can expose them to, the more that they can experience it for themselves, whether it be through stories, food, languages, just seeing their parents, or have friends that look different. I think it all just sort of adds up to creating that environment in which they can understand that people look different, they are different, and we have to grow up sort of respecting that idea.
Thank you. We might have time for one more question, but just a quick remark on that. I'll just add, I think have the conversation with the child. May be simple to say, but in my experience in context of race in the U.S., children don't have the baggage,
Mm.
right? They're just noticing difference, and don't place your baggage on them as an adult. Just be open and have the conversation. Don't tell them it's not nice to talk about people who are brown skinned, because then that sends the kind of a different message. So that's something that I know I've experienced. So don't be afraid of it, but also don't put your own stuff onto the child. So let's go to Peter. That might be our last question. I know there's a question from a student. If you want to type that into the.
Yes, Taj, I just suggested to Storm, our student, that she goes ahead with her question.
Okay, just saw that. Thank you. Go ahead, Storm.
All right, sure. So I'm South African, and I'm currently at the Zagreb campus. And I obviously grew up in a very diverse country, and being here, I kind of guess it's a bit of a question of some advice on how to maybe view your diversity as something that isn't like a social separator, but rather maybe something as something that just makes you you. And yeah, just some advice as maybe how to not view it as what makes you completely different than like a bit of an outsider. So.
All right, maybe I can try, right? So if I understood Storm, and welcome, it's good to hear you. The thing is it more about fitting in, or?
I guess, yeah, kind
Yeah,
of
all
not
right,
really
yeah.
feeling defined by the differences.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of Croatians, they are, we could say, welcoming people in terms of especially being a tourist country. But then I understand the obstacle when you come to a college like RIT Croatia, where the majority of students are from Croatia, or a country where we share similar languages, that you sort of feel left out. Just as Rebecca was mentioning at the beginning, there's this language barrier, and that sort of leads you out. So in terms of fitting in, I don't think in life it's a good idea to fit in. I think you being different is something that you should cherish. And I think students who had courage, who were smart enough to talk to you and to share their ideas with you, I think they benefited from that, from a very different perspective than we have in Croatia. So I would say that you being different is not something that you should be trying to lose in Croatia. I think it's something that you should be proud of. I mean, I understand from the point of view of being a young person and trying to be at the level of your peers and blending in, but I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. And maybe Rebecca and Ambareen can give their 2 cents, because I think it's a very good question, Storm.
I think, Storm, what you want is to make friendships and have relationships. You don't want to become like everybody else around you. You can't, and you don't need to. And that's something that I also kind of came to face, during the many years of living in Croatia. Sometimes I would catch myself and like, why do I think I have to act just like all Croatian people do, or do what everybody else is doing around me? I don't have to fit in. I don't have to do all the things they're doing in the way they want to do it. I can do things my own way, but at the same time, you want to be able to have relationships with people. You want to be able to feel connected to people. And so the practical thing is to try to pick up even little tiny symbolic bits of the language will open a big door for you. Even if it's just a few words or enough that you can catch the gist of what people are saying in the conversation. And to that point, I would really don't be hung up at all about making mistakes or sounding perfect. Just try to grab on to some fun little bits of conversation and enough to follow what people are saying. And that's gonna open some doors for you, and it's gonna help people feel more connected to you. So whether that's through like a little guidebook or little classes or just finding a friend who can help you learn a few key phrases, I think that's a good place to begin.
Right. There are not any other thoughts on that. I'm going to respect folks' time. And I don't know, that we're all different time zones. I want to especially respect that. So thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate you taking time out your busy schedules, whether it's morning or evening or midday. We really appreciate that. And we're really hoping to continue this program. And so especially those of you on our global campuses, love to continue to figure out ways that we can build those bridges and introduce other staff, faculty, or students from your areas so we can keep this going. This is something I plan to continue to do for as long as I'm at RIT Rochester. So we have lots of opportunity to collaborate. All right. So thank you all. Thanks to our interpreters, and everyone have a good evening or a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.